Willow Creek, Ohio, September 14, 1980. The scream never came. 14-year-old Sarah Jensen left her house at 7:43 p.m. for a walk around the block, wearing a light denim jacket, Converse sneakers, and a smile she didn't know would be her last. She never returned. No struggle. No neighbors heard anything. By 8:30, her father was walking the streets, flashlight in hand, calling her name. By 9, the Willow Creek Police Department was out in force. At 10:12 p.m., her mother broke down sobbing into the front porch railing as a cruiser's red and blue lights cast cruel shadows across the family's tidy lawn. By morning, the search had gone county-wide. This wasn't supposed to happen here. Willow Creek was a postage stamp town, 2 diners, 1 high school, and folks who waved from their front porches. Missing kids were a story for big cities. Not here. Not to Sarah. But the air had shifted overnight, and by sunrise the entire town felt it. Something had gone terribly wrong. Among the responding officers was Jake Riley, 27 years old, clean uniform, military jawline, new to detective duty but carrying himself like a man who had already buried mistakes. With him was his partner, 4 legs, 92 pounds of pure focus, ears high and alert, Shadow. A German shepherd with eyes that scanned faster than any radio, trained in search, scent, and suspect apprehension. He didn't bark, he didn't wag, he didn't need to. He worked. Jake parked his cruiser on Maple and 3rd right near the Jensen house and clipped Shadow's lead onto his vest. "Let's find her," he whispered. The neighborhood reeked of confusion. Police officers spread out in teams, local teens, formed search lines combing fields and backyards. Someone handed Jake a plastic bag with Sarah's hairbrush in it. Shadow sniffed it, then locked in like a missile. He moved fast, pulling Riley along like a tow line. Within minutes, Shadow darted off the grid, away from the search parties, away from the streets lit by porch lamps and worried neighbors. He tugged, toward the edge of town, past the old canning factory, through a brushy service road and into the dense pine scrub near Crooked Hollow Creek. It wasn't on anyone's search map. It didn't make sense. Until Shadow stopped. He didn't bark or dig at first. He stood still, tail rigid, nose twitching low over a patch of disturbed earth just under a willow tree. Then, suddenly, he scratched. Furiously. Riley knelt. The soil had been turned recently. Beneath the surface, he found a partial shoe print, heavy-set tread. Then, glinting in the sunlight like a quiet scream, a shard of metal, jagged, oily, and broken off something bigger. No blood, no clothing, no sign of Sarah. Just an eerie stillness. He bagged the evidence, marking it in his notebook. Unusual location. No witnesses. Unexplained stop by Shadow. It was the first and last lead they'd get for days. On the 4th day, a pair of hunters found Sarah's body in a drainage ditch 11 miles northeast. Her clothes were torn, her fingers scraped raw. The medical examiner ruled it assault followed by strangulation. The community was shattered. The police blamed the scene by the willow tree as a diversion. The killer had probably used it to throw off the trail. The print, the metal, filed away and forgotten under. Inconclusive in Shadow's behavior. Just a dog being a dog. The press called it a tragedy. Jake Riley called it a failure. The town moved on in the way small towns do, slowly, uncomfortably, with flowers and candles, then silence. They named a library wing after Sarah. Her parents moved 2 years later. People stopped bringing up the case at church, but Jake didn't move on. He couldn't. Not with the way Shadow had reacted that day. Not with the look in his dog's eyes when they walked away from that willow tree. Something had been there. Something real. Shadow continued to serve with honor, tracking fugitives, finding lost kids, even saving a man from a frozen river. But Riley always remembered that one scratch in the dirt, that one lead they'd ignored. And then the years passed. Riley got older. His brown hair turned gray around the edges. He moved to the cold case unit. Shadow eventually retired. Arthritis, taking his speed, then his steps, then quietly, his life. Riley buried him under the big oak tree behind his house, with a brass tag that read, K9 Shadow, he knew. In the silence of the Willow Creek police archive, among the dust and paper, Sarah Jensen's case file still sat, a manila folder stuffed with half-truths, clipped articles, and fading Polaroids. Riley opened it every year on the anniversary, just to remember, just to hope. 25 years later, he opened it again. But this time, he sent the evidence to the lab. He held the broken metal fragment in one hand and stared long at it. Something about it still didn't sit right, and in the back of his mind he swore he could hear Shadow's paws on the old service road again, tapping, scraping, waiting. Riley didn't know it yet, but the case was about to break wide open. Willow Creek, Ohio, September 2005. The folder was heavier than it should have been, not in weight, but in memory. Detective Jake Rico. Riley sat alone in the Willow Creek Police Department's cold case unit, thumbing through a case file that had haunted him for 25 years. Yellowing pages, Polaroids faded to gray, handwritten notes from officers long since retired or buried. Sarah Jensen, 14, murdered in 1980. No justice, no closure. And one thing still gnawed at him. Shadow. Riley reached into the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out an old photo. Himself in uniform, 27 years old, crouched beside a younger version of the German shepherd he'd buried behind his house. In the photo, Shadow looked alert, focused, like he knew something no one else did. Because he did. The problem was, no one had listened. Riley sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. The world had changed. Forensics had advanced light years beyond where they were in 80. DNA analysis had become a silent witness in cold courtrooms. What once took rooms full of people and weeks of lab time could now be processed in hours. He wasn't sure if it would help, but after 25 years of silence, any whisper was worth chasing. So he did the unthinkable. He reopened the case. At 7:12 a.m., Riley personally drove the carefully sealed evidence, Sarah Jensen's jacket, a swab of hair and fiber taken from under her fingernails, and a slide containing a dried biological stain, to the Ohio State Lab in Columbus. He signed everything over under chain of custody protocols stricter than Homeland Security. Then he waited. 2 weeks passed. No calls. On the 15th day, his office phone rang. "Detective Riley?" said the woman on the other end. "This is Dr. Anya Sharma from the State Lab. I need to speak with you in person." Riley didn't ask questions. He drove. In the sterile hallway of the State Crime Lab, Dr. Sharma met him with a stack of papers and a look that said, "Brace yourself." "We ran all 3 items through modern DNA profiling," she began, motioning him into a small briefing room. The fibers under the fingernails were degraded, but the biological fluid sample was perfectly preserved. She placed a printout on the table. Riley leaned in. "There's a Codis hit," she said. He blinked. "A hit? After 25 years?" She nodded. "A 1 in 5 billion match. No doubt." Riley's fingers clenched around the edge of the table. "Who?" "Marcus Thorne," she said. The name thudded against the inside of his skull like a hammer. Marcus Thorne. That wasn't new. In fact, it wasn't even unfamiliar. Riley recognized it instantly, because he'd met him before. Back in 1980, Thorne had been a construction worker with a couple of assault priors, bar fights mostly, nothing that had landed him in prison. He'd been questioned during the original canvass of the neighborhood. At the time, he had an airtight alibi, drinking with buddies at a local dive bar across town. 3 people vouched for him. The detectives marked him as cleared. Now, the evidence was saying something very different. Riley drove back to Willow Creek in silence, the wind roaring through the open windows. As soon as he arrived at the precinct, he dug into the archives and pulled the original interview notes. There it was, black ink on aging paper. Thorne was at Charlie's Tavern with 3 witnesses, time confirmed, no further action. Riley stared at the page, disbelieving. Charlie's Tavern had been torn down in the early 90s. But the names of the witnesses were there. 3 men, all local. He underlined them in red. He turned to Thorne's 1980 mugshot. Young, stocky, leather jacket, unshaven, and behind the eyes something empty. Why didn't we press harder? Riley muttered to himself. Then a memory flickered. The apartment door. Shadow growling. Not barking, growling, low and threatening. Eyes locked, on Thorne's jacket. Riley had dismissed it back then, said the dog was just reacting to a known felon. Told him to quiet down and move on, but dogs don't lie. The next day, Riley started digging. He found the 3 original alibi witnesses. 2 were still in Ohio. 1 was in a VA care home in Michigan. None of them were doing well. He started with Donnie Ray, now 62, retired and living in a trailer park outside Dayton. Donnie, Riley said after flashing his badge. I'm reopening the Jensen case. Donnie froze. That was a long time ago. I know. And I think Marcus Thorne paid you to lie for him. The man's eyes darted like a trapped animal. I don't remember. I do. Riley cut in. You swore he was with you that night. But we have DNA proof he wasn't. That puts you on the hook for obstruction at minimum. Donnie crumbled. In a whisper, he said, It was $300 and a bottle of cheap whiskey. He said he just needed to not go back to jail. Riley didn't move. So you sold out a dead girl for $300. Donnie nodded, ashamed. The other, 2 cracked just as easily. By the end of the week, Riley had a signed affidavit from all 3, confirming Thorne was never with them that night. The perfect alibi? A complete lie. Riley didn't wait. He found Thorne in a small rental property outside of Akron, working as a maintenance man under a fake name. No wife, no kids. A simple life, built on the ashes of someone else's. As Riley and the arrest team knocked on the door, Thorne answered in sweatpants and a faded tee. He looked older, heavier, but the eyes hadn't changed. You Marcus Thorne? Riley asked. The man didn't respond, just stared. Riley showed him the warrant. Thorne exhaled. Then, as they turned him around to cuff him, he said something Riley never expected. The dog knew, didn't he? Back then. Riley looked at him, face cold. It only took science to prove his truth. Jake Riley sat alone in the cold case office, a cup of stale coffee growing colder by the minute. He stared at the old file again, this time with new eyes. The DNA hit on Marcus Thorne was solid. 1 in 5 billion odds. No question. But the man had an airtight alibi that had stood for over 2 decades. That kind of contradiction didn't happen without someone lying. He flipped through the brittle 1980 paperwork, stopping at the 1-page interview with Thorne. It had been brief. Too brief. A note scribbled in the margin said Thorne had answered the door shirtless, reeking of cheap beer and sawdust. Claimed he'd been drinking with buddies at Mackey's bar the night Sarah disappeared. 2 friends backed him up. Riley hadn't done the interview himself. He was a junior detective back then. New badge, new uniform. But something about that date tugged at him. He closed his eyes, trying to recall the chaos of those first few days. Shadow had been glued to his side, following leads, sweeping buildings, chasing shadows. Then it hit him. He had taken Shadow on a follow-up visit to a suspect on 12th Street, right after finding the metal shard under the willow. The apartment was 2 blocks from the tree. Low-income housing, peeling paint. 1 porch light flickering like it couldn't decide whether to stay on or off. That suspect had been Marcus Thorne. Jake's memory sharpened like a blade pulled from its sheath. He could see the front door opening, smell the damp wood of the hallway. Thorne had stood there, beer in hand, that worn leather work jacket slung over the back of a recliner. And Shadow had growled, not the usual alert bark, not a whine, a deep, low growl that started in his chest and never rose. Controlled, focused. Shadow had stepped forward, muscles tight, nose twitching, eyes locked on Thorne's jacket. Riley had yanked the leash. Shadow, knock it off, he'd snapped, embarrassed. That's enough. He'd chalked it up to the dog reacting to Thorne's rough look, maybe the smell of booze or stale sweat. He hadn't thought twice. But he should have. Riley stood abruptly, sending his chair screeching across the tile. He paced, palms on his head, heart thudding. Shadow had known. He had smelled something, someone on that jacket. Something the dog couldn't verbalize, but had tried to say with every fiber of his body. Sarah. Her scent had been there. On Thorne, on that jacket. 2 blocks from the site, Shadow had scratched into the earth and he had dismissed it. Shut it down. Muzzled the only witness that had told the truth. Damn it, Riley muttered, voice cracking with guilt. He sat back, down, his fingers trembling as he pulled the old photo of Shadow from the file cabinet. The black and white image showed the German shepherd in his prime, head high, eyes sharp, a silent warrior waiting for orders. He remembered the way Shadow had looked at him after they left Thorne's apartment. Not with confusion, not even disappointment. Just silence. A silence Riley now realized was heavier than any bark. He hadn't just ignored a lead. He'd silenced a warning. Back at his desk, Riley began a new timeline. He cross-referenced the time Sarah was last seen, around 7:45 p.m., with Thorne's supposed arrival at Mackey's bar across town, clocked at 8:10 p.m. That left 25 minutes. Enough time to intercept a girl walking home, stash her temporarily, and drive across town to establish an alibi. Riley dug up the police map from 1980. The tree where Shadow had stopped. It was on a dirt path that led directly to 12th Street, Thorne's block, a direct line. And yet, they'd believed the bar story. He picked up the phone and dialed the archives. I need audio or transcripts of any calls made to Mackey's bar between 7:30 and 8:30 p.m. on September 14th, 1980, he said. Also see if we ever logged anything about Thorne owning a vehicle back then. He hung up and sat back, chest tight. All these years, all this guilt. Shadow had pointed at the killer. The evidence didn't need to be found. It had already been barked, scratched, and stared into Jake Riley's soul. He'd just chosen human reason over animal instinct. But not anymore. He pulled up the most recent lab report, highlighting the part that made everything undeniable. DNA recovered from the inner lining of Sarah Jensen's sweater is a 1 in 5 billion match to Marcus Thorne. Then he opened a clean notepad. At the top, he wrote, Shadow's warning. Scented suspect's jacket at Thorne's apartment. Suspect lived 2 blocks from soil disturbance. Dog reaction consistent with known scent behavior. Disregarded due to human error. He looked again at the old photo of Shadow. I'm listening now, he whispered. I promise you. I hear you. Outside, dusk was falling over Willow Creek. The same dusky light that had covered the town the night Sarah disappeared. But this time, the air didn't feel like failure. It felt like reckoning. He wasn't just reopening a cold case. He was testifying for someone who never got the chance to speak in court, a K-9 officer who couldn't talk, but whose instincts had never been wrong. This time the leash wouldn't hold the truth back. This time Shadow's voice would be heard. Marcus Thorne's house looked like any other on the block. Gray vinyl siding, trimmed hedges, and a tired American flag that hadn't been replaced in years. The mailbox still had his name stenciled on it, faded from sun and time. Jake Riley sat, across the street in an unmarked car, arms folded across his chest. He wasn't a rookie anymore, not by a long shot, but his pulse still ran hot. 25 years. 25 years this man had walked free, attended barbecues, probably smiled at little girls on sidewalks. Inside the glove box, Riley kept a small folder. It held Sarah Jensen's photo, the lab's DNA match report, and a hand-drawn sketch of a shoe print from back in 1980. All arrows pointed here, to the man who for a quarter century had lived under the radar. But DNA wasn't enough. To take Thorne down and make it stick, Riley needed to dismantle the man's alibi piece by piece, publicly, legally, and beyond the reach of any fancy defense. He started with the bar. Back in 1980, Thorne had claimed he was drinking with two buddies at a place called Rusty's Tap, room the night Sarah disappeared. The original detectives had taken it at face value. No one had pressed hard. The bartender at the time, long dead, had allegedly vouched for them, and that was that. Riley pulled up the address listed in the original file. The bar had burned down in '89. What stood in its place now was a storage unit facility with rows of beige doors and blinking motion lights. He found one of Thorne's old drinking buddies living in a nursing home in Dayton. Arthur Phelps now, 71, had Parkinson's and a voice like wind through dry leaves. At first he claimed not to remember much, but when Riley placed the DNA match on the table, the old man's eyes changed. "We were scared," Arthur finally said. "Marcus told us to lie, said he needed a solid story. He gave me a stereo, brand new, still in the box. The other guy, Ricky, got cash." Riley leaned forward. "Did he ever tell you what really happened that night?" Arthur looked away. "No, but he came to the bar late, looked different. Jacket smelled like wet dirt. Told us what to say if cops asked. I knew it wasn't right. I knew." One domino down. Next came Ricky Burke, the second witness. He was harder to find. After bouncing through jobs and states, Ricky had settled outside of Akron. Riley showed up unannounced, greeted by a man with sunburned arms and nicotine-stained fingers. Ricky tried to close the door. "You know why I'm here," Riley said calmly. "It's been a long time. You don't have to carry his lie anymore." Ricky hesitated. "He told me the girl was dead already. Said they'd never find the body. He gave me $300 and a bottle of Jack. That's what her life was worth to him." The weight of that sentence made Riley's jaw clench. Back in Willow Creek, the lab confirmed what Riley already knew. The sample from Sarah's sweater was Marcus Thorne's. Not possibly, not probably. It was 1,000,000,000 to 1 certainty. It was time. The SWAT team stood ready, but Riley waved them off. He walked up to Thorne's front door alone, knocked once. Thorne answered in stained sweatpants, a cold beer in one hand. His face didn't register surprise, just recognition, like a man watching old debts finally come due. "You know why I'm here?" Riley said. Thorne took a slow sip of beer. "You got the DNA?" "We do." "You got the sweater?" "We do." "You got the stories?" "Every last one." There was a silence between them, the kind only time can shape. Then Thorne spoke. "The dog knew. Back then, didn't he?" Riley didn't blink. "He knew." Thorne nodded slowly, like a man who had seen this moment in his dreams. "He wouldn't stop staring at my jacket. You paid for an alibi. You couldn't pay off Shadow." Riley turned him around and snapped on the cuffs. Inside the house, Riley noticed something strange. Lined along the wall were small, detailed carvings of German shepherds. Not menacing, not heroic. Just present. Watching. It sent a chill down his spine. At the station, the interrogation was short. Thorne clammed up. His lawyer screamed about inadmissible testimony and the age of the case. But Riley didn't need confessions. He had truth. He had science. And most of all, he had two men willing to break the silence they'd held for decades. But something still gnawed at Riley. A question that wouldn't let go. Why had Thorne left? That piece of metal buried beneath the willow tree? What did it belong to? Riley revisited the old crime scene files. The fragment had been logged as non-evidentiary, not connected to Sarah's clothing, not part of any known weapon. But something in Riley's gut said otherwise. He took the fragment to a forensic tech who scanned its edges and ran it through modern material databases. A match hit. It was part of a construction-grade tool, a tension bar used in trenching projects, the kind of tool Marcus Thorne would have had access to when he worked road crews in 1980. It was another thread, another lie unraveling. When he got back to his desk, Riley pulled out Shadow's old case report. The entry from that day, the scratch, marks, the shoe print, the metal, it had all been there. The truth had barked at them, scratched at them, hell, it had practically howled. But they hadn't listened. That night, Riley went home and poured himself a glass of whiskey. He sat on the porch, the file open on his lap. He wasn't just building a case anymore. He was honoring a promise to a dog that couldn't speak and a girl who never got to grow up. The next morning, he handed everything to the prosecutor. The arrest warrant, the forensic trail, the coerced witnesses. This time, there would be no cold case, no silence. This time, the dog's warning would be heard. The courtroom was ice cold. Detective Jake Riley sat in the witness box staring across the polished floor at Marcus Thorne. 25 years had turned Thorne's face to leather, but Riley recognized the same emptiness in his eyes, the same dangerous calm he remembered from the apartment on Lincoln Avenue. This was the man who had taken Sarah Jensen's life, and for a long time, he had gotten away with it. Now the weight of 1,000,000,000 truth pressed down on the courtroom like gravity. The trial had lasted 6 days. The prosecution opened strong, painting Thorne as a calculated predator who exploited a fragile alibi and vanished into a quiet life until DNA finally dragged him into the light. They laid out the science, the timeline, and the mistakes made in 1980. Riley had sat through every word, his jaw tight, fists curled on his thighs. But the defense was ruthless. They called Dr. Anya Sharma, the forensic scientist who'd handled the biological evidence, and tried to dismantle her expertise piece by piece. They claimed the samples had degraded. They said no evidence could survive 2 decades without contamination. They called the preservation methods outdated, inconclusive, and even unreliable. Dr. Sharma never blinked. She explained the chain of custody, the refrigerated storage, the double-sealed packaging, and the testing techniques used in 2005. She looked the jury in the eye and stated clearly that the match was statistically indisputable, 1 in 5 billion. The courtroom fell into a hushed silence. Still, Thorne's attorney pressed on. He argued that DNA alone didn't prove guilt, that evidence that old should never have been allowed, that memory fades, that the world had changed since 1980, and so had people. He was building doubt, slowly, methodically, 1 inch at a time. Riley knew the jury needed more than science. They needed to feel it. When the prosecutor asked Riley to testify, he stood, adjusted his tie, and walked to the witness chair. He glanced once at Thorne, then locked eyes with the jury. He started at the beginning. He spoke of the night Sarah disappeared, of her parents, of the panic that spread like wildfire through Willow Creek. He recalled Shadow, young, alert, unstoppable, leading him far off the search path. He described the moment the dog stopped, scratched at the ground, and waited. He told them how he'd found a heavy-set boot print, a broken piece of metal, and how none of it had seemed to matter once Sarah's body was found elsewhere. "I was new," Riley admitted, voice steady but thick. "Young enough to believe that if the paperwork didn't line up, then the gut feelings didn't count." He paused, let that sit, and I ignored my partner's instincts. He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped tight. Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was trained to do what humans couldn't. He didn't understand lies, he understood scent, truth. He knew the smell of fear. And the day we knocked on Marcus Thorne's door in 1980, Shadow growled. Not out of aggression, not instinct, but recognition. A few jurors leaned in. Shadow was scenting Sarah Jensen's blood on Thorne's jacket. But I didn't listen. I dismissed it. I told myself the alibi was solid, that we were wasting time. He looked at Thorne again. That was my failure. The courtroom was silent. I've spent every day since asking myself what would have happened if I had trusted the dog over the man, if I had pushed harder, if I had believed instinct instead of ink on a report. The prosecutor nodded gently. "What changed?" Riley drew a breath. When the evidence came back from the lab and it pointed to Thorne, I wasn't shocked. I was ashamed. Because a German shepherd figured it out 25 years ago. All we had to do was listen. Thorne's attorney objected, but the judge overruled it. Riley continued. The oldest piece of evidence we had in this case wasn't the DNA. It was the dog's nose. And it was right. He stepped down from the stand to a room so quiet it sounded like grief. When the prosecutor rested the case, all eyes turned to the jury. They deliberated for 7 hours, not because they were unsure, but because they felt the weight of it all. The Jensen family sat in the front row, hands tightly interlocked. At 4:23 p.m., the foreman stood. "We find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder." Sarah's mother gasped and covered her face. Her father buried his head in his hands. They wept not out of celebration, but release. A grief that had been trapped behind a locked door for 25 years finally spilled out. The courtroom did not cheer. It did not clap. It simply breathed for the first time in decades. Marcus Thorne was taken into custody. He showed no emotion. He simply turned once, just once, to look at Riley as he was escorted out. "You always knew, didn't you?" he said. Riley met his eyes. He did. Later that night, Riley didn't celebrate. He didn't pour a drink or call his daughter or sit in. The glow of justice. He drove to a quiet park outside of town, to the old oak tree behind his house. The headstone was simple. Canine Shadow Faithful. Until the end, he placed something new at the base of the stone. A small, polished medallion engraved with a badge and a paw print. It shimmered under the moonlight. "I got him," Riley whispered. Wind rustled the leaves overhead. You were right. Willow Creek, Ohio, fall 2006, the courthouse was packed. Not with reporters or onlookers, but with people who had waited decades to see the weight of truth finally settle where it belonged. Marcus Thorne sat motionless at the defense table, the wrinkles around his mouth deepening with each passing minute. He didn't look like the monster people had imagined. No horns, no cold stare. Just an aging man with sun-spotted hands, wearing a cheap brown blazer that didn't quite fit. But the jury had seen through it. They'd seen the DNA, heard the lies unravel, watched as the prosecution connected a 14-year-old girl's final moments to the fibers in a jacket, to the bark of a dog who had tried to speak the truth back when no one was listening. Now, the gavel dropped. Life without parole. Detective Jake Rico Riley didn't smile when the sentence was read. He didn't exhale. He simply closed the worn case file on Sarah Jensen one last time and nodded to the prosecutor before walking quietly out the courtroom door. Outside, under a golden canopy of falling leaves, Sarah's parents waited. Her mother's hair was white now, and her father leaned on a cane. Riley approached them gently, extending his hand. But her mother ignored the handshake and embraced him, holding on longer than expected. When she stepped back, tears streaked her face. "You didn't give up," she said. "After all these years, you didn't let her be forgotten." Riley's voice cracked. "I couldn't. Shadow wouldn't have let me." That evening, Riley stood alone at Shadow's grave beneath the old oak tree in his backyard. The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the grass. He knelt slowly, age creeping, into his knees and placed a small silver medal on the flat stone marker. It had arrived in the mail a week earlier, an honorary commendation from the state K-9 division. It read, "For exceptional instinct and lifelong service, K-9 Shadow, Willow Creek PD." Riley rested his hand on the stone, feeling its coolness beneath his fingers. "You were right all along, buddy," he whispered. "I should have trusted you. I should have pushed harder." The guilt had never left him. Not really. But standing there now, he also felt something else. A kind of peace. Justice hadn't come fast, and it sure as hell hadn't come easy. But it came, and in the end, that mattered. The next morning, Riley wore his formal blues for the first time in years. He walked slowly through the Willow Creek Police Department's lobby, nodding to younger officers who had heard his name in passing, but had never worked a case with him. They gave him respectful glances, stepping aside as he made his way toward the training wing. There, on a new brick wall near the K-9 unit office, hung a freshly mounted bronze plaque. At the top, it read, "The Willow Creek Cold Case. Resolved, 2006 in memory of Sarah Jensen, 1966-1980, and in honor of K-9 Shadow, whose nose never lied." Below the inscription, a simple etched profile of a German shepherd stared straight ahead. Ears perked, eyes alert, as if still on the trail. Riley stood in front of it for a long time. "You did good, partner," he muttered. Later, that month, a scholarship was launched in Sarah's name, the Sarah Jensen Memorial Scholarship for Forensic Science, to support local students entering law enforcement or crime lab programs. Her mother was the one who suggested including Shadow in the plaque, because he was the first one who found the truth. Riley returned to the station less and less after that. He eased into semi-retirement, taking on the occasional consulting case, mostly cold ones. The young detectives came to him for advice now, how to read a crime scene, how to read a suspect, and most importantly, how to read your dog. "Ignore the bark, watch the tail," he'd say. "And if your canine stops cold and doesn't move, that means something. Don't dismiss it. Ever." 1 year later, a young officer knocked gently on the door of Riley's house, holding a clipboard and a small box. Inside was a thank you letter from the state and a formal invitation. They were naming the K-9 training grounds in Columbus after Shadow. Riley set the letter down on the kitchen table. For a while he just stared out the window, watching the wind blow through the leaves. Then he smiled. Not big, just enough. Some say justice is blind, others say it's slow. But in Willow Creek, they know it wears fur and walks on 4 legs. Shadow had passed before the trial, never knowing his nose had outlived doubt, evidence, and human error. But now every new K-9 unit in Ohio would learn his name, his story, his legacy, and Sarah Jensen, bright, kind, full of life, would never again be reduced to a cold case file. Her name lived on, etched in bronze, whispered in the halls of justice, and carried forward in every young cop who dared to listen, not just to the evidence but to instinct. Because sometimes the truth doesn't speak in words. Sometimes it growls. Thank you for following this story to the end. If you were Detective Riley back in 1980, would you have trusted the dog over the man with the alibi? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe dogs are more honest than people, share this story.